Hi everyone and welcome. I am, as always, the Aussie IT contractor. Like many city-based workers, I've been mainly working from home for the last 3 years or so, but the push to get the troops back into the office at least a couple of days a week has finally caught up with me. Finding myself on public transport for 2 hours a day gives me plenty of time to muse about life in general and occasionally reflect on my contracting career. So today's topic of what misconceptions I had of contracting before I started came to me simply to cover the time that I was aimlessly staring out the window and watching the scenery pass that I'd seen so many times before. Alrighty, let's get the most embarrassing one out of the way first. Before I started my first contract, I had this vision of contractors being the elite within their chosen field. Like you would have to be the very, very best around to be hired on as a contractor. I mean, look at the day rates a contractor gets. They must be hired for the most high profile of gigs. Thus, the contractor was almost a glamorous rock star in their field. But of course, the reality is that contractors are pretty normal in most ways, maybe a little bit more self-reliant, but otherwise no different to any perm in the matters of skills and abilities. In my defence, I started contracting pretty early in the contracting scene, and I only knew very few contractors at that point, and they were pretty well on top of the pile when it came to abilities and skills because they were the ones that were confident that they could find work as they needed and were willing to give up the security of a permanent position. Following on from my glamour misconception, I thought the contractors would become well known in the industry, that after all they were the elite workers, and so companies would be seeking me out for new roles based solely on my contracting reputation. I thought that potential clients would be chasing me to work for them. Now, of course, finding a new contract is comparable to finding a new permanent role, utilising things like job searches, contacts in personal networks, and job agencies to introduce me to prospective employers. The whole process of polishing up the CV, applying for roles, going through interviews and the selection process is no different between perm and contract roles. I would take more time off and enjoy longer holidays. Hey, my first contract paid double the annual salary of my last perm role, so I could easily trade off how much I worked and still come out well ahead. There will be plenty of opportunity to take longer and more frequent holidays between contracts. As it turns out, there are a few problems with that. Life always catches up with your income. After a while, you find yourself with a spouse and some kids and a mortgage in one of the world's most expensive housing markets, and a few little luxuries start creeping into your lifestyle. And before you know it, taking 3 or 4 months off of unpaid time each year doesn't look as financially appropriate anymore. Also, no client is going to be happy with a contractor wanting to disappear for a few months mid-project, and taking extended time off between the end of the last project and starting a search for a new one means that you're out of work for a longer period of time. So there's never a good time to take a large block of time away from work. As a side note for Aussies who get 3 months long service leave, no such thing for contractors. On to taxes. Surely contractors would have a really complex tax situation. After all, you keep changing who you're working for. But fortunately, I was wrong on this in a very good way. In Australia, and I presume in other enlightened countries as well, a permanent employee's employer withholds tax from each pay and sends it to the taxation office, and also provides a group certificate at the end of the year which shows how much tax was withheld for that person. The employer also makes superannuation or pension contributions to your super or retirement fund. The good news for contractors is if you don't contract via your own private company, your agency will take on these payroll tasks. So, technically, while the agency doesn't employ you, they do perform these PAYG withholding and superannuation contribution functions, so there's no change to the tax and super process in any real way. Ultimately, in Australia at least, a PAYG contractor's tax return looks no different to a permie's tax return. If, however, you do want to use your own private company to contract through, you will need to look after GST, PAYG and super, but that takes me less than an hour a month, and I use an accountant to look after the company tax returns. And of course, I do have a video on setting up and running a private company as a contractor. If you would like to learn more, please check out the links below. So while I thought that tax was more complex than it really was, I also thought that the client-contractor relationship was very simple. Perhaps my naive belief was that the permanent employment contract was simply replaced with a contracting contract and I would be employed by the client. But the reality. The simplest relationship is the contractor, the agency and the client in a PAYG relationship. The most complex I've been involved in is me, the contractor, my private company, the introducing agency that found the role for me, the payrolling agency that paid the payments to me, and the client. But even with that arrangement, I completed timesheets with the client and the income payments were deposited to my company account. Then the agencies and the client worked out the commissions and the payments between themselves. The hope that the contractor community would just happen. I thought the contractors would get to know each other, it would be a small community, and it would end up being a little bit like a club. However, contracting lifestyle is very transitory. At the end of each project, the contractors you've worked with for the past 1 or 2 years all go their own ways. Now, I've been fortunate to come across contractors I've worked with previously a few times, but it isn't overly common. For contractors and perms, it's important to build your own network and make an effort to keep in touch with people you've got to know through your career. It doesn't just happen by itself. I seriously underestimated how long I would continue to contract for. I had this vague plan that I would contract for maybe 5 to 10 years, and then either my massive contractor experience and exposure would set me up for some magical senior executive permie role and kick off my high-flying career, or my equally massive contractor income would set me up for early retirement, and that all that fat cash would see me head for the beach and breakfast cocktails, and there would be no need for me to work too many years. Well, hey, in either case, contracting wasn't going to continue forever, but more than 2 decades later, I'm still working and still contracting. I've often been asked by clients if I want to return to a permie role, so the opportunity is there. However, for me, the benefits of contracting continue to outweigh those for perm, and while the bank account isn't healthy enough for me to hang up my contracting boots, there's probably another decade or so for contracting for me. I was unaware of the extent of the background checks I would need to go through for every single contract. I've worked for the same client multiple times. On occasion, I've finished a contract up with client A, gone off to do a 1-year contract with client B, and then returned to a new project with client A. But there's no such thing as just being checked for the last year. Every background check goes back to the dawn of time. The process is the client will engage a specialist background check provider. Now, some are easier to deal with than others. I've recently had a background check provider who seemed to not understand contracting at all, leading to a very long and frustrating process. These background checks are part of the client's corporate governance to make sure that they're employing someone who is actually who they represent themselves to be. So the things that the background checker will look into is your 10 years of residential history, so everywhere you have lived, so that they can conduct a police background check in each of those states. Your tertiary qualifications, they'll actually go to your university and make sure that you're not inflating the qualifications that you have. And some also require an employment history to confirm you did actually work for those companies. Additionally, depending on the industry you're working in, some will check with the relevant regulatory authorities to see if you've been black banned or red flagged. This is probably not truly a misconception, but probably an underestimation of just how extensive and long my resume would become. After 20 plus years of contracting, I've worked in a lot of different roles at many companies, many more than I would have in a similar length of permanent employment. It's understood that the common rule for resumes is to keep them under 3 pages in length, but that's not so easy for a long-term contractor. I could just condense the earlier decades, but sometimes a client wants specific experience, so if I condense too much, that means that experience isn't shown. It's a challenge to keep the CV to a reasonable length while still imparting the width and depth of experience that a contractor has to offer. My final contracting misconception, and for those counting along, yes, this is number 10, was that there would be a Contractors Club where people within that club wouldn't share information to permies that were outside of the tent. They would want to keep their contracting secrets to themselves because that would make them more rare. Well, that's totally not the case. If you are considering making the leap or already in your early days of contracting and my humble videos aren't enough to satisfy your thirst for knowledge, find a friendly, experienced contractor within an organisation that you work for, and for the price of a coffee or a beer, they'll be more than happy to let you know why they became and remain a contractor and give you some tips on things you may need to know.